Thank you. Thank you, and good evening to all of you. And as soon as I walked into this place, I felt right at home. And it was empty then. Now I'm going to talk a little bit about this new book that I've spent the last 7 or 8 years researching and writing with my co-author, Joe Torres. But just, I'd like to talk a little bit about some of the shows that we've been doing at Democracy Now!, since so many of you are listeners. We did a show this morning, which was really amazing. We had several guests, but the one that really stunned me was William Binney, who was for close to 40 years, worked for the National Security Agency, one of the top officials in the National Security Agency. And he quit on October 25th of 2001, when he realized that the agency that he had devoted his entire career to, and his work, he believed, trying to secure the United States from threats from abroad, when he realized that the government was turning the programs that he had developed, because as he said on the show, in the late 1990s, the NSA was being deluged by all of the intelligence it was gathering from around the world. And he had to develop, or he managed to develop, a program for being able to sift out the valuable intelligence from all of the background noise that the agency was sweeping up. And then after the 9/11 attacks, he began to realize that his program and his efforts were being turned inward on the American people. And he made a startling statement. He says that he believes that every single email of every single American is being collected by the National Security Agency, and is being collected and stored, and that the level of surveillance is far greater and far more in breach of the Constitution and all the existing laws of the nation than most Americans realize. And so Binney quit rather than be a part of the continuing redirection of the NSA's efforts within the United States itself. He subsequently became a whistleblower, helping several journalists and also he complained not only to the intelligence oversight committees of the House and the Senate. He actually, he's a registered Republican, and he actually at one point tried to reach the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court to explain the violations that were occurring of American law and the Constitution, but no one would listen to him. So he eventually then decided to go to some reporters, and then in 2007, I think, the FBI raided his house in the morning, put a gun to his head, separated him from his wife and children, and began questioning him, initially arresting him, but then they decided later on not to indict him. But this story of an American who feels totally betrayed after spending his entire career working for the government is, I think, being replicated more and more across the country as we see the transformation of what there were already problems, many, many problems, as we all know, with the policies of our government. But in the last few years, as the empire has seen itself under assault, the level of surveillance and repression against American citizens, whistleblowers, more whistleblowers prosecuted under the Obama administration, than all previous administrations combined. So it was a startling show, and I hope many more people will download it and listen to it and hear William Binney's story. We've also been reporting on a more local incident that occurred back in November, because the nation has been mesmerized, of course, by the Trayvon Martin case and the continuing problems of racial profiling. But we began reporting a few weeks ago, both on Democracy Now! And I've done numerous columns in the Daily News about the case of Kenneth Chamberlain, a 68-year-old retired former corrections officer, former Marine, who was in his apartment in White Plains, New York, on the morning of November 19th. He had a heart condition, and so he had a life alert system, Life Aid, the company, it could respond whenever his heart pendant went off in case he had a heart attack. And that night, he apparently, inadvertently, while he was sleeping, set off the pendant, and when the Life Alert company, which had an actual connection directly to his house, that they could, a two-way phone where they could question him, and they said, "Mr. Chamberlain, are you okay? This is Life Aid." And he did not respond, so they immediately called the police and asked the police to come and check his apartment to just make sure he was okay. So the police came on a mercy mission to see if everything was okay with him. They woke him up. He was upset about being awakened at 5 o'clock in the morning. He told the police through the door, "I'm okay, no need for you to be here, I'm fine." But they insisted that he open the door. And he said, "Look, I'm a 68-year-old man, I'm tired, I want to go to sleep, go away." And they then began pounding on the door. More police arrived, DSU units, fire and ambulances. And they finally, took the doors, the hinges off the door. And there was one police officer who was heard because they were not aware that the Life Aid call box was taping everything. So the one police officer was heard screaming at him using the N-word and ordering him to open the door. They then, as soon as they opened the door, took the hinges off. And we know this because there was a video camera on a taser, on a police taser that was aimed at the door, and there was a security camera in the hallway. So there were two cameras, plus there was an audio tape from the Life Aid company inside the apartment. So as soon as they opened the door, the police lit up the taser and fired it at Mr. Chamberlain, who was seen in the video dressed only in his boxer shorts. And they then shot shotgun pellets at him. Beanbags, shotgun beanbags at him to try to disable him. And when all that failed, one police officer shot him with his revolver and fired twice and shot him once in the chest and killed him. That was on November 19th. The grand jury in White Plains only began meeting last week. People are complaining about the delay in the Trayvon Martin case. This happened back on November 19th. And the Westchester Police Department, the White Plains Police Department has a history of some of these cases. In fact, I was able to not only get the name of the police officer who fired the gun that killed him, but also learned that next week that same police officer is facing trial in a federal civil suit by two Muslim brothers who say they were assaulted by him and handcuffed, brought to a police precinct called Ragheads by the same officer who fired the gun that killed Mr. Chamberlain, who apparently is still on the force. So that there's a major problem in White Plains, and unfortunately, the Westchester County District Attorney does not have a sterling record when it comes to prosecuting police abuse cases, and it remains to be seen how vigorous she will attempt to go after this case, because, the grand jury, was a former chief judge of New York, Sal Wackler, who once said, a DA can indict a ham sandwich if he wants to in a grand jury. So it's all a question of what kind of evidence the DA presents to determine whether the police officers involved in this particular incident will be held responsible for their actions. So we've been reporting quite extensively in Democracy Now! On the Chamberlain case, as well as what's a variety of international stories, the continuing crisis with the popular movement in Syria, and many other stories that we present a different perspective, as you all know, from what you normally get in the commercial media. First of all, I think the greatest accomplishment of Democracy Now! Is that it actually lets people talk in complete sentences. Doesn't seem like much, but watch the national news and watch the local news, and I defy you to find a person uttering a complete sentence that's actually whole when they are quoted. The complete sentences all come from the narrators of the news, not from the subjects of the news. Anyway, but what I am most passionate about these days is, because Democracy Now! Is a unique experiment in our time, but it's not a unique experiment in terms of the history of the press in America. But unfortunately, it's not all of the press in America, as we know. And I have worked it's my 35th year as a professional journalist, earning my full-time pay from reporting the news. The last 25 of them as a staff columnist at the New York Daily News, and the past 16 years also working since we started Democracy Now! And I've grown increasingly frustrated, just as Mr. Binney was frustrated, having devoted my entire working career to journalism by the sorry state of the media in America. We have more news in the United States than any people in the history of the world. We have 1,400 daily newspapers in the United States. It's shrinking, but still, there's still 1,400 of them. About 1,200 television stations, 12,000 radio stations, 17,000 roughly magazines. We've got hundreds of channels to choose from on our cable systems, and lots of all news channels, all news business channels, all news sports channels, all news channels. We've got thousands of internet news sites that we can download at any hour of the day or night. And yet the American people are so remarkably misinformed about the world around them. How is it possible to have so much media and so little knowledge? When we are practically the only nation in the world where there's still a debate as to whether climate change is real or not. You know that something is wrong with the kind of news and information that the journalists of America are producing. When 2/3 of the American people believed in the build-up to the Iraq War that Saddam Hussein had something to do with the 9/11 attacks. You know that something is drastically wrong with the work that the journalists of America are doing. All Americans are dissatisfied with the news media, whether you're a conservative or a liberal or radical or moderate. All the polls show, if you look at the Pew Center for the People in the Press, Gallup polls, public confidence in the news media is at an all-time low. There is a sense that the media do not care about the interests of the people. They care more about the profits that they can make, the commercial media, most especially. And so I started asking myself a few years ago, why? Why has it been so difficult for the press in America to present a more complete and nuanced view and to spread light rather than heat in its coverage? And so I realized that even though I'd been involved in the media system for 35 years, I didn't understand the system myself. And most journalists and reporters never take the time to examine their social role in society and the role of their institutions. So I decided that if I didn't understand it, and I looked around at all the books that have been written about the press, and there's lots of them, and some of them are okay, and some of them are terrible, but none of them try to take a comprehensive look at the evolution of the media system in America. So my co-author, Joe Torres, and I decided if we may as well give it a shot. We can at least make some contribution to it. So that was the sort of the genesis of our attempt to start this project. Because I've been lucky in that I've been able to work in what I call the three great streams of the press in America. There is the commonly known or regarded commercial or for-profit or corporate press, which I spent lots of time on. There's the Democracy Now!, and I've been privileged to work with one of the great journalists of our time, Amy Goodman, for the past 16 years, is part of another great stream of the press in America, the dissident rebel press. It also has a proud, long tradition, going back to the working men's presses of the newspapers of the 1830s, to the muckrakers, Upton Sinclair and Ida Tarbell and Ray Stannard Baker, the progressive muckrakers of the late 19th and early 20th century, to the New Left press of the 60s and the 70s, to the progressive bloggers of our time. That's a whole separate stream of the American press, the rebel, dissident, non-commercial press. But there's also a third stream that I've also had the privilege and the opportunity to work in. It's what's commonly called the ethnic or minority press. Back in the 1980s, when I was just a young reporter at the Philadelphia Daily News, I started and edited a weekly Spanish language newspaper in North Philadelphia for the Latino community, the growing Latino community. And even before that, when I was in the Young Lords, for a while I was the editor of our own newspaper, Palante, a bilingual newspaper that we produced in the early 70s. And the ethnic or minority press is another stream of the press in America. And one of the things that amazed me about all of these streams is that they have operated almost not only independently of each other, but almost oblivious to each other's existence. Not really knowing that there's this other world or paying much attention to this other world, which is also creating news and also is a forum for the battle of ideas and interpretation of historical events. And so we attempted with this book to do two things. One is go back over the history of how our media system got to be where it is today. At the same time, deal with these other strands, particularly what has happened with the press of color in America. Because all Americans are dissatisfied with the press, but people of color are furious with the press. African Americans and Latinos and Native Americans feel assaulted on an almost daily basis by the press. They feel marginalized. They feel their lives distorted, their contributions ignored. The only attention that the press pays them or their leaders is when there is scandal. And there is a sense of constant assault by the press. So in each case, we went back to the beginning and tried to learn the lesson of how this happened. And I'm going to try to summarize it because it is a complex story and it took quite a bit of sifting out and understand that whenever you generalize about any process, you're always going to not recognize that there are exceptions, that everything doesn't neatly fit into a schematic, but that there are general trends that we've been able to identify that I think will help people to rethink not only how press got to be where it is today, but what can be done to change it. The first thing that I think we grasped is that our media have never operated in a free market system. That in fact, the American people have contributed greatly to subsidize the development of our media system. And that in fact, government policies have played a critical role in fashioning the system that we have today. Political decisions about how news and information will flow in a democracy have been debated and decided at key junctures throughout American history. Most of the time, the American people were not even aware these debates were occurring. And I harp a lot on the first debate because I think it is the most provides the best understanding of how policy, media policy works. It was the creation of the first internet, not the current internet, the first internet. The first internet was called the United States Postal System. United States Postal System. In 1792, a huge debate erupted in Congress over the creation of the postal system. There had been a continental postal system that the British had set up, a colonial postal system that the British had set up, but now in 1792, Congress had to decide how the American Republic would shape its postal system. And the founders had a huge debate over that postal system. Because most people don't understand that the main job of the postal system was not to deliver letters. It wasn't to deliver private mail. Throughout the entire 19th century and into the middle of the 20th century, the main job of the United States postal system was to deliver newspapers. 90% of the traffic of the United States postal system, the weight of the traffic of the system was newspapers. 10% was private letters. It was a huge system to spread newspapers around the country. Why? Because as the country, remember, was initially largely a rural country. There were 13 colonies spread over a huge territory, and the founders felt that in order for those citizens of this new republic to function as citizens, they needed information. They needed exchanges of news of what was happening with the other colonies and with their new government. So the postal system was seen as the way news and information flows, not only from the government to the people, but among the people themselves. And the newspapers were the vehicles that provided that information back and forth. So what was the debate about? The debate was, well, shall we carry newspapers at market rates, the same rates we carry the private mail at, or shall we carry it at discounted rates, or shall we carry it for free? Washington, Jefferson, Franklin all favored free delivery of newspapers by the government to its people, under the theory that the greatest possible dissemination of news and information was critical to the preservation of the republic. Madison and several others of the founders said no, the market, whatever the market cost of delivering papers is, that's what the publisher should pay. As often happens in the United States, they reached a compromise. The compromise was called the second-class postal system. Right. You see second-class mail on all your circulars. That means that that is being delivered at subsidized rates. Not the people who put that stuff in the mail have to pay something, but they're not paying the cost, the actual cost of delivering those newspapers or those circulars to you. So in essence, there was a huge debate in 1792 over communications policy, information policy. And as a result of the government's decision to subsidize newspaper delivery, the United States quickly developed the biggest newspaper culture in the world. Every small town in America, anybody who could print a paper, the government was delivering it. Right? And there were constant debates that erupted in Congress over postal policy throughout the 19th century. For instance, the small states insisted that the subsidy be greater in-state than for out-of-state papers. Why? Because if you were a publisher in a small town in Mississippi, you did not want a paper from New York or Washington, D.C. to be able to get into your state at the same rate and therefore ruin your competitiveness. So that the states fought for in-state higher subsidies. In the 1890s, Congress approved free rural delivery. So if you were a publisher in the boondocks of Montana, where there wasn't a town for 50 miles, and you wanted to publish a newspaper, the government would deliver it to every farmer in that area for free, because they felt that the rural areas should have their own newspapers too. There were constant battles over postal policy. Until the Civil War, the postal system was the largest employer in the United States government. There were more postal workers than there were soldiers in the Army until the Civil War. So you could argue, at least until the Civil War, if the postal system was the largest employer in the government, and the main job of the postal system was to deliver newspapers, you could argue the main job of the United States government until the Civil War was to deliver newspapers to its people. And you had competing papers. You had African-American newspapers, Latino. There were 30 African-American newspapers in the United States before the Civil War. There were nearly 100 Spanish-language newspapers. The city of New Orleans alone had 25 Spanish-language newspapers before the Civil War, including a daily, Patria, that began publication in 1846. There were 25 Chinese-language newspapers in the United States before the turn of the 20th century. So it was a diverse, and it was a press that had all kinds of competing political views. It was a much more robust press. Now, it was still racially segregated. You know, there were only white reporters and editors working on the white papers, and African Americans on the black papers, and Latinos on the Spanish language papers. But everyone had an opportunity to speak and be heard because the government was delivering newspapers at subsidized rates. But one of the other things we've discovered as we delved into the book is that every time a new communications technology comes around, it upsets the existing order and requires the government to step in and create new rules. So technology is a revolutionary force, but that revolution then requires new rules, and those are the constitutive decisions of media policy that Paul Starr talks about in his wonderful book. So what happens is in the 1840s, you get the development of the telegraph. Now, telegraph is a whole new thing because now news flows instantly over those wires. And again, remember the federal government subsidized the first, Samuel Morse's first telegraph line was subsidized by Congress. As soon as it began operation, Morse told the government, this thing is so valuable and so powerful that I want to sell all my patents to the government. The government should run the telegraph. And in fact, in most other advanced countries in the world, in England and France and Germany, and even in Canada, the telegraph was government owned. Only in the United States was the constitutive debate that occurred at that point moved in a different direction. Because the business community said, wait a second, this telegraph, man, if there's silver discovered somewhere in a mine in Nevada and I can get the information first before anyone else can, that's money, right? So the business community immediately insisted that the telegraph be privately run. And so that constitutive debate was lost for the people, unlike the postal debate, which was a victory for the people. And so what ends up happening is that you have the development of a whole bunch of telegraph companies, private companies, but within a few years, within about 15 years, one company buys up all the others. And that company becomes the first industrial monopoly in the United States. It's called Western Union. Western Union became the first industrial monopoly in the United States. It created an alliance with the railroads and with the Associated Press, the new cooperative of news organizations that had developed in New York City, and they proceeded to centralize the flow of news and information. So from a decentralized, autonomous, more democratic system that existed in the era when the postal system was all-powerful, the telegraph created a centralized system of news. And we go into the book into exactly what that meant, but understand that that's what happened. But then what happens is a new technology comes on the scene, radio. In the early 1900s, radio. Now you can not only transmit words, you can now transmit voices, and you can now transmit music. Radio immediately, thousands of young amateur radio operators take to the airwaves. There were African Americans on radio, Latinos on radio. There were churches that developed radio shows, and colleges, and local governments. Everybody was getting into radio. And radio was said to be, as the internet is often said to be, the great liberator of our time. But radio upset the existing order of news communication that Western Union and the AP controlled. So the government had to step in again to resolve the problem. The government stepped in 1927 with the Federal Radio Act, in 1934 with the Federal Communications Act, and the government proceeded to knock most of the non-commercial stations, and McChesney talks about this in his studies of early radio, knock all the non-commercial stations, the churches, and the minority groups, they were all knocked off the air, and the most powerful frequencies, the clear channel frequencies, were given to two rising new business communications companies called NBC and CBS. And so the initially decentralized autonomous radio system was centralized as a result of government policy in the hands largely of the two networks and also some newspaper owners. From the legacy media wanted to get in on the new media, so all the newspapers started buying up their own radio stations. And so you had a re-centralization of the media system in America. But then a new technology comes along in the 1970s, not TV, because TV was really an extension of radio. The same companies that controlled radio controlled television, but cable was different, because cable allowed the development of local cable companies all around the country. And there were it's called CATV, Community Access Television was how it started. And it was supposed to be different from commercial television because there were not going to be any commercials on cable. You just subscribed and there would be no commercials. And once again, cable was going to be this great liberator because every community would have its own news, its entertainment and news operation. But, and the government basically let private companies run the whole thing. So what happened with cable is very much like what happened with the Telegraph. Within a few years, a couple of companies bought up everybody else. Actually, it took about 20 years total. But so that today in America, 2 cable companies own about 50% of the market, Comcast and Time Warner. And they have increasingly removed a lot of the public access and public service requirements of their cable systems and increasingly bought off politicians to do away with a little bit of public access, even though they have 1,000 channels now, whereas when they started they had maybe 17 or 18, they still don't want to give much to the public. So you had a re-centralization which culminated in the 1996 Telecommunications Act, where now the phone companies were freed up to get into cable service as well. So now you have Verizon Fios and you have AT&T UVerse and all this other stuff. But what happens? Technology subverts the existing order again. The internet comes along. And so now the internet has subverted the existing order, and all the other legacy media companies are trying to figure out how they can gain control of this new development. And so we are now going through the 5th major communications policy battle in American history. The post office, the telegraph, radio, cable, and the internet. Each one of these has determined how news and information will spread in a democracy for generations. And often the battles occur without much public involvement. Once in a while, the public gets involved and is able to win some victories. But once you understand that government policy plays a critical role, that it's not really a free market because there's government subsidies all up and down the line in all of these. After all, who financed the development of the internet? National Science Foundation, DARPA. It was the government that developed, that financed the initial research that led to the development of the internet. It was the Navy, in addition to the various radio inventors that also during World War I helped develop radio technology. In fact, the Navy sponsored the development of the Radio Corporation of America, the trust that came out of World War I. And Navy even had a representative on the board of directors of the Radio Corporation of America when it was formed in 1919. So we've been able to understand is, one, government policy plays a critical role. Technology continually subverts the existing order and requires new policies to be developed. And there is always a battle between whether news and information should flow centrally or be local and autonomous to preserve democracy. And those are the key features of how our media system got to be where it is today. When the right decisions are made, you get a better, a more democratic system. And the other thing we've discovered is that people of color have a greater opportunity to speak and be heard when the system is decentralized. As it gets centralized, as ownership gets centralized, as gatekeepers get established. For instance, the Associated Press, as I said, in its alliance with Western Union, controlled basically most news in America throughout the latter half of the 19th century. 90% of the content of most small-town papers in America was AP wire copy coming out of New York City. The AP, however, didn't admit into its membership any African American or Latino or Native American-owned newspapers. So by it being a cooperative, a club, it was able to keep differing content on race out of all newspapers in America. It wasn't until 1945 that the Supreme Court ruled the Associated Press a monopoly and ordered the Associated Press to stop excluding people from membership, newspapers from membership in its association. But that happened in 1945, 100 years after the AP was founded. So we looked at the system itself. The other big thing we did, as I said, is look at the impact on race and ethnicity and how Americans see race and ethnicity. Because I believe that the news media have been the primary authors of the white racial narrative in America. They have written the first draft of the white racial narrative in America. And it started from the very beginning. We went back to the first newspaper in America, actually in the colonies. Public Occurrences, 1690, Boston, Massachusetts. Benjamin Harris, an Anabaptist printer who fled England because the Parliament was constantly shutting down his papers. He comes to Boston, opens up a bookshop, and then bookshop, it becomes a gathering place to debate ideas. He decides, well, I'll start a newspaper here in Boston. So he starts Public Occurrences in 1690. It's shut down after one issue by the governing council of the Massachusetts colony because he raised some criticisms of the local British governor. But the reason it was shut down is not as important as to see the content of the paper. There were 5 separate articles. The bulk of the copy in the first newspaper was about the barbaric Indians that were menacing the colony. It was an intelligence sheet for the settlers as to what was happening among the natives of the Massachusetts colony. There was only one, what you could call positive content article. That was a small little article about how a group of Christianized Indians in Plymouth was celebrating Thanksgiving. But other than that, all of the articles were these incredibly vicious descriptions of the natives and the threats that they posed to settlers. And as we began to look at the content of early colonial newspapers, we found enormous percentage of the papers was devoted precisely to that. Intelligence to the settlers about the Indians. Another huge portion was about slave insurrections, about individual violence by slaves against their masters, or about, in the northern colonies, the threats posed to the local community by free blacks. So a huge portion of the content of papers in the colonial era was about Africans and Native Americans. And this continued throughout into the late 19th century and early 20th century. And of course, once the Western territories were annexed after the Mexican War, about Mexicans as well. But the papers weren't content merely to misrepresent and provide intelligence. The papers became a primary instrument for orchestrating and fomenting massacres, pogroms, lynchings, and we have compiled in this book an astounding number of examples. If you take the time to go through it, you will be shocked at the level of involvement of our press in creating racial violence. The role of the Tucson Citizen and the Arizona Star in the Camp Grant massacre in Arizona. The role of the Rocky Mountain News in the Sand Creek massacre in Colorado. The role of a bunch of the Western newspapers in riots and attacks on the Chinese communities in the far west. Because everyone concentrates more or less sometimes when they do, on some of the major incidents of how the white press covered conflicts between blacks and whites. But there were numerous other examples of what occurred in terms of Native Americans and Mexican Americans. And there was, of course, the example that I've raised a couple of times on Democracy Now! Is my favorite because it was such an influential figure, is the Wilmington coup of 1898. In November of 1898, 2,000 armed white citizens of North Carolina marched into Wilmington, the capital of the state, which at that time had a majority black population. And it was one of the last cities in the South to still have a Reconstruction government, so it had a majority black city council. So they marched into town, they burned down the local black newspaper, Alexander Manly's Wilmington Record, which was a daily. They burned it down, and we have a picture in the book of the mob posing outside the burned out newspaper. They then rounded up all of the elected black officials at gunpoint, put them on a train, shipped them out of town, deposed them all. They appointed a former Confederate officer as the new mayor of Wilmington. And then they proceeded to shoot up the black community. Dozens of African Americans were killed, hundreds had to flee the city. It was an armed coup. The only successful armed coup in American history of a local government. No one interceded. The federal government didn't come in. State militia didn't come in. They just took over the town. But the amazing thing is that the entire event was organized and led by the local newspaper publisher, Josephus Daniels, who was the editor and publisher of the Observer, the Raleigh Observer. Now, Josephus Daniels was a prolific writer, one of the most celebrated Southern editors of his time. So prolific that his autobiography is in 3 volumes. And in volume 2, he talks about his role in the Wilmington coup. He talks about meeting every night in the newspaper office with the leaders of the white insurrection, planning the coverage that they would put into the newspaper every day, the next day, to incite the white citizens of North Carolina to prepare them for the days to come. Now, you'd say, well, Josephus Daniels is some crazy lunatic Southern editor. No, Josephus Daniels was a populist. He campaigned against the Duke Company and against the railroads. He was a supporter of William Jennings Bryan. He was a confidant of Woodrow Wilson. When Woodrow Wilson gets elected president, he names Josephus Daniels Secretary of the Navy. Josephus Daniels was our Secretary of the Navy during World War I. Right? As Secretary of the Navy during World War I, one of the people he mentored was a young assistant secretary named Franklin Delano Roosevelt. When FDR gets elected president, he names Josephus Daniels ambassador to Mexico. Josephus Daniels was a major Southern editor and a major political figure in the United States. But this happened he was Secretary of the Navy in 1917. He was ambassador to Mexico in the 1930s. In 1898, he was a murderer. He was a racist. He was a person who boasted of burning down a newspaper in his own town, a newspaper editor who boasted about burning down a newspaper in his own town. Never held responsible for any of that. About 6 or 7 years ago, the state of North Carolina established a commission, the Wilmington Race Commission, which re-examined the events of 1898. They published an entire study of it, which you can get on the internet. All of the newspapers issued public apologies about their role in what happened in 1898, all the local newspapers. Now, that's great that they issued apologies, and it's terrific that there was a study that documents what happened, but it came 100 years after the fact. 100 years, it took that long to recognize what the press had done in North Carolina in November of 1898. And like that, there are many other examples that we have in the book, not only of the role of the press, and we go to, you can go up to 1962 in Mississippi, and how the radio and television stations that incited the residents of Mississippi to riot to prevent James Meredith from integrating the University of Mississippi. Dozens of federal marshals were wounded in 2 days of rioting, spurred by the local radio and television stations that exhorted the population to come out and prevent James Meredith from entering the University of Mississippi. So there are many examples throughout the history of the country, but we also tell the story of the heroes of the press that never get any attention, which is those individual African American and Latino and occasionally white editors as well who stood up against this, whether it was William Lloyd Garrison and his Liberator, whether it was people like Jovita Idad, the great Mexican-American editor of La Crónica in Laredo, Texas, whether it's Pedro González, the radio announcer in the 1930s, whether it's Elias Boudinot, the first editor of the first Native American newspaper in the world, the Cherokee Phoenix in 1828. Now understand that Cherokee did not even have a written language until the 1820s when Sequoyah developed an alphabet to express the Cherokee language, and within a few years the entire Cherokee nation had become literate in the new written language. And in 1828 they started publishing their first newspaper. And it was a beautiful newspaper, and we quote several of the articles in it standing up against the attempts of the Georgia settlers to move the Cherokee off their land until the Georgia militia attacked the paper and destroyed the press about 7 years later. But there were other Cherokee newspapers that developed in the Oklahoma Territory and in Louisiana and other places. So there's a vibrant Indian press as well in the country. And so we try to tell some of those stories. Of course, the most famous, the first, it's interesting to recall the words of the first black newspaper, which was Freedom's Journal in New York City in 1827. In that first newspaper, Samuel Cornish and John Russwurm, in their opening editorial, said, "We wish to plead our own cause. Too long have others spoken for us. From the press and the pulpit, we have suffered much by being incorrectly represented. Men whom we equally love and admire have not hesitated to misrepresent us disadvantageously without becoming personally acquainted with the true state of things, nor discerning between virtue and vice among us. The virtuous part of our people feel themselves sorely aggrieved under the existing state of things. They are not appreciated." You could write that today, but that was written in the first black newspaper in America in 1827. So that these voices stood up and were often suppressed. We talk about, I mentioned Jovita Idad, but she was not only a valiant editor, but campaigning against lynching of Mexicans in Texas, of school segregation, but she also, in 1914, criticized the president for sending troops down to the Mexican border during the Mexican Revolution. And Texas Rangers immediately surrounded her press in Laredo. And she read them the Constitution as she stood in the doorway to prevent them from getting into the newspaper. Now, of course, any of you who've been to South Texas, you know that there's a lot of Mexicans in South Texas. Laredo is like maybe today and was then about 90% Mexican. So the entire town turned out, and the Texas Rangers had to retreat. But then they came back that night and they destroyed her press. And then, of course, the example that I also talk about often is Pedro González, and I'll leave you with this one because this has a lot more relevance for today. Pedro González was a radio announcer in Los Angeles in the 1930s. He was a singer, actually. He started out as a singer, cut a few records, was very popular. And so he was invited to do a radio show early in the morning. And he had a band called Los Madrugadores, the early risers. What they would do is they would sing starting around 4 o'clock in the morning on their radio show as the farm workers were going out into the fields. And so they attracted a huge following. But this was the early 1930s. The Depression had started. The Hearst newspapers began a campaign all around the country that there were too many illegal Mexicans in the country, and they were taking American jobs. So the papers kept hammering it, like our TV talk hosts and radio hosts do today, some of them. So President Hoover initiated a mass deportation program of Mexicans between 1930 to 32. More than 1 million Mexicans were deported from the United States. They were just rounded up. Same kind of things that are going on now in Latino communities, surrounding whole communities, grabbing everyone up, checking their IDs, putting them on, but only then they wouldn't like put you in a detention center. They put you on a train and ship you immediately to the border. A commission later that studied it concluded that many American citizens had been wrongly deported. But more than 1 million Mexicans were deported. So Pedro González, who was an entertainer, suddenly decided he had to do something. So he began using his radio show to rail against the human rights violations that were occurring against the Mexicans who were being deported. He was promptly arrested by the Los Angeles District Attorney on a rape charge and convicted and sentenced to San Quentin, a term in San Quentin prison. When he got to San Quentin, he saw the conditions were so horrible, he immediately organized a hunger strike against the prison conditions in the California prison system. That sounds familiar, doesn't it? He stayed in jail until 1940, when the young woman who he had been convicted of raping recanted her testimony and admitted that the authorities had put her up to it to jail Pedro González. So Pedro González was released from prison, immediately put on a train from San Quentin to the border, to Tijuana, and deported from the country, where he remained for decades as a radio announcer in Tijuana. In the late 1990s, he moved back to California, and he was in his 90s by then. He died in Lodi, California, a few years ago. Now, Pedro González is a hero of the American press. At a time when no one else dared to speak up against the mistreatment of hundreds of thousands of people, he stood up and was jailed for it and was later deported for it. And just like Pedro González and Frederick Douglass and Cornish and Russworm and Jovita Hidar and so many others that we have in this book, these are heroes of the press in America that are largely unknown. No one knows their stories. No one knows their traditions. So what we've tried to do is resurrect that part of the press. Not only tell the story of how our system got to be where it is today, but also tell the stories of people who fought to make it better. And as I said before, there were white Americans as well who played a critical role. Reverend C. Everett Parker, of the United Church of Christ, who led the battle to desegregate Mississippi television in the 1950s and won the critical court decision that established the right of citizens to sue before the FCC on the issues of public interest being served by radio and television stations. That court decision was finally decided in 1969, right? It took years of back and forth, and the very WLBT, the NBC affiliate in Jackson, Mississippi, which was at the heart of the case, was turned over to the black community as a result of that. And immediately after that, a huge citizen movement to reform radio and television developed. Between 1970 and 1973, right, just a few years after the WLBT decision, there were 340 license challenges to the radio and television station licenses of companies across America. Groups of African Americans and Latinos marched into their radio station and their TV stations, and they said, we're sick and tired of your coverage. We're sick and tired of the fact that you don't report the positive things about our community, that you don't employ any folks from our community, and that you claim to serve the public interest. And as a result, the radio and television stations were so struck by this revolution that occurred that they started hiring large numbers of African Americans and Latinos to work in the white media. That's how Ed Bradley got on WCBS. That's how Geraldo Rivera got on WABC. That's how Connie Chung got onto television. That's how many of the first generation of African American and Latino reporters got on the air, because the communities were sick and tired. They finally had some support from the courts in the WLBT decision, and they were able to open up the doors and change the nature of television and radio for a while. But then along comes the Reagan Revolution, and the first thing they did is, in those days, you had to renew your station license every 3 years. They upped it to every 8 years. So now the television stations didn't have to worry about constantly renewing their licenses, and they had put on all other kinds of safeguards, again through legislation, to prevent that kind of popular movement from continuing to grow. So you see, you can have change sometimes. People do affect change, but the problem is you have to be constantly vigilant because, not only the people learn from their mistakes. These media owners, these business folks, they learn from their mistakes as well. And they come up with new strategies, and you have to refight the battles all over again that you fought 20 years ago or 30 years ago or 60 years ago. So it is a constant battle, but it's a battle it's a battle over how will news and information flow in a democracy, and how will citizens be armed with the best possible information to function as citizens. So it's a very important battle. And that's what I've tried to do all these years. I've been working both in the commercial media, in the dissident and rebel media, and in the ethnic and minority media. I believe it's all one press in America, and that we have to stop seeing each other as separate. We have to begin to see how each can contribute to a better understanding of the news of the day. So I'll leave it there, and I urge you, those of you who get a chance to read the book. You'll get a lot. I've only scratched the surface of what's in here, because I think that Joe and I have done a pretty good job of at least beginning to understand how the system works. And once you understand how it works, then you can understand how to change it. Thank you very much.